The year was 1852, in Virginia's Riverside Plantation, where the morning mist still clung to the cotton fields like a shroud of sorrow. Sarah sat in her cramped wooden cabin, her hands trembling as she gripped a stolen piece of paper and a broken quill. The candle beside her flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Today was the day she would be torn from everything she had ever loved. The night before, Master Calloway had made his announcement in the great house while Sarah served dinner. His cold voice had cut through the air like a blade as he told his wife that Sarah would be sold south to the cotton plantations of Mississippi. The words had made Sarah's hands shake so violently that she nearly dropped the silver platter she was holding. But the worst part, the part that made her want to scream until her throat bled, was what came next. Her 8-year-old son Thomas would stay behind. The master's wife had taken a liking to the boy and wanted to train him as a house servant. Sarah would never see her child again. Now in the dark hours before dawn, Sarah held the forbidden pen in her calloused hands. Teaching slaves to read and write was illegal in Virginia, punishable by whipping or worse. But years ago, Master Calloway's daughter Emma had secretly taught Sarah her letters, meeting her in the barn late at night and showing her how to form words on scraps of paper. Emma had been young then, full of abolitionist ideas she had picked up from books. Her father didn't know she was reading. Then Emma had married and moved to Boston, and Sarah had never seen her again. But the gift of literacy remained, hidden and precious. Sarah's tears fell onto the paper as she began to write. Her letters shaky but determined. She poured her heart onto that small piece of parchment, telling Thomas how much she loved him, how she would think of him every single day, how he must be strong and survive until freedom came. She told him to never forget who he was, never forget that he was her son, and that he was precious and worthy of love and dignity. Her hand cramped as she wrote, but she didn't stop. This letter was all she could give him now, the only piece of herself that would remain after she was gone. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin wall, Sarah carefully folded the letter and wrapped it in a piece of old cloth. She tucked it deep under Thomas's sleeping mat, in a place where he might find it later, when the pain of her absence became too much to bear. She looked at her son's sleeping face one last time, memorizing every detail, the curve of his cheek, the way his small hand curled under his chin, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. She wanted to wake him, to hold him, to tell him goodbye properly, but she knew that would only make it harder. Instead, she pressed a kiss to her fingertips and touched his forehead gently, then turned away before her resolve could break. The slave trader's wagon arrived just after sunrise, the sound of wheels and chains announcing its presence like the rattle of death itself. Sarah was led out into the yard with her hands bound in front of her. The other slaves on the plantation had gathered, their faces a mixture of grief and helplessness. They had all seen this happen before, families ripped apart like paper, children sold away from mothers, husbands separated from wives. It was the machinery of slavery in motion, grinding human hearts into dust. Thomas had woken to find his mother gone from their cabin. He ran outside in his thin nightshirt, his bare feet slipping on the dewy grass. When he saw Sarah standing by the wagon with chains on her wrists, he screamed and tried to run to her. Old Moses, one of the elderly field hands, caught him and held him back, even as the boy thrashed and cried. Sarah fell to her knees in the dirt, her eyes locked on her son's face. She tried to speak, to tell him she loved him, to tell him to be brave, but her throat had closed up with grief, and no sound would come out. The trader yanked her to her feet and shoved her toward the wagon. Other slaves were already inside, their faces hollow and resigned. As the wagon pulled away, Sarah twisted around to keep Thomas in sight for as long as possible. He was still struggling in Moses's arms, still screaming for her, his voice raw and desperate. The sound of his crying followed her down the road until distance finally swallowed it. Sarah sat in the wagon bed, swaying with the motion of the wheels, and felt something inside her die. She was still breathing, still alive, but a fundamental part of her soul had been torn away and left behind in that plantation yard. The journey south was a nightmare of heat and hunger and despair. Sarah was sold in a market in Natchez, Mississippi, standing on an auction block while white men examined her teeth and felt her arms to judge her strength. She was purchased by a cotton planter named Rutherford, who owned thousands of acres, worked by hundreds of slaves. The plantation was called Magnolia Grove, though there was nothing graceful or beautiful about it. It was a place of endless labor under a burning sun, of overseers with whips, of exhaustion so profound that slaves would collapse in the fields and have to be dragged to the shade. Sarah worked in those fields for 15 years. She picked cotton until her hands bled, until her back became a map of scars from the overseer's lash, until she forgot what it felt like to not be tired. But through it all, she thought of Thomas. Every night before she slept, she whispered his name like a prayer. She imagined him growing tall and strong, imagined him learning to read somehow, imagined him thinking of her. She clung to the hope that one day, when freedom finally came, they might find each other again. The Civil War arrived at Magnolia Grove in 1863, when Union soldiers marched through and declared that all slaves were now free. Sarah was 50 years old by then, her body worn down by years of brutal labor, her hair completely gray. When the soldiers told her she could leave, she didn't know where to go. She had no money, no possessions, except the ragged dress on her back. Many of the freed slaves stayed on the plantation because they had nowhere else to go, working now for tiny wages that barely kept them alive. Sarah stayed too, but only long enough to save a little money. Her plan was to make her way back to Virginia, back to Riverside Plantation, back to the place where she had last seen her son. It took her 2 years to save enough money to make the journey. She walked most of the way, hitching rides on wagons when she could, sleeping in fields and abandoned buildings. When she finally reached Riverside Plantation in 1865, her heart was pounding with hope and fear. But when she arrived, she found the plantation house burned to the ground, destroyed during the war. The slave cabins were empty and collapsing. There was no one there. No Thomas, no sign of where he might have gone. Sarah fell to her knees in the ruins of her old cabin and wept until she had no tears left. She spent months searching for him, asking questions in every town and city she passed through. She went to churches where freed slaves gathered, to freedmen's bureau offices, to settlements of former slaves trying to build new lives. She showed people a small piece of cloth she had kept from Thomas's baby blanket, as if that scrap of fabric might somehow help someone recognize her son. But Virginia was chaos in the years after the war, and thousands of freed slaves were on the move, searching for lost family members, trying to piece their shattered lives back together. Meanwhile, Thomas had indeed survived. He had been kept at Riverside Plantation throughout the war, working as a house servant for Master Calloway. When Union troops arrived and announced emancipation, Thomas was 23 years old, tall and strong, despite years of inadequate food and harsh treatment. He had taught himself to read by stealing books from the master's library and studying them in secret by candlelight. He had never forgotten his mother, and the first thing he did with his freedom was search for her. Thomas had found the letter. His mother had hidden under his sleeping mat back in 1852. He had kept it all those years, even though he couldn't read it at first. When he finally learned to read well enough to understand her words, he had cried for hours. The letter became his most precious possession. Proof that he had been loved, proof that his mother had not wanted to leave him. Now, as a free man, he was determined to find her. He traveled south, following rumors and fragments of information. He heard that Sarah had been sold to Mississippi, so he made his way there, walking hundreds of miles, working odd jobs to earn money for food. When he reached Magnolia Grove in 1866, he learned that Sarah had left a year earlier, heading north. They had missed each other by months. Thomas felt despair trying to drag him down, but he refused to give up. He continued searching, his mother's letter always folded carefully in his pocket, close to his heart. In 1867, Thomas heard about a large gathering of freed slaves in Alabama, a reunion where people came from all over the South hoping to find lost family members. Thousands of people attended these gatherings, holding up signs with names, asking if anyone had seen their mother, their father, their children, their siblings. The air was thick with hope and grief, with joyful reunions and heartbreaking disappointments. Thomas arrived at the gathering with his mother's letter clutched in his hand. He stood on a makeshift stage and held the letter up high, his voice breaking as he called out to the crowd. He told them his mother's name, told them she had been sold from Virginia to Mississippi in 1852, asked if anyone had seen her or knew where she might be. The crowd listened in sympathetic silence. Most of them had similar stories of loss and separation. Then, from the back of the crowd, a thin elderly woman began to move forward. She was leaning on a walking stick, her movements slow and painful. Her dress was patched and faded, her face deeply lined with age and hardship, but her eyes were fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the crowd part to let her through. Sarah had heard her son's voice and thought at first she must be dreaming. She had dreamed of this moment so many times that she no longer trusted her own mind. But as she moved closer and saw his face clearly, saw the shape of his jaw that was just like her father's, saw the way he held himself with dignity despite everything he had been through, she knew it was real. Her son was standing right there in front of her. After 15 years of separation, after endless miles of searching, they were finally in the same place at the same time. Thomas saw her coming toward him, and something in his chest recognized her, even though she looked so different from the young woman he remembered. He jumped down from the stage and ran to meet her, catching her just as her legs gave out beneath her. They sank to the ground together, holding each other, both of them sobbing so hard they couldn't speak. The crowd around them was crying too, sharing in their joy and pain, because everyone there understood what this reunion meant. Sarah held her son's face in her shaking hands, trying to convince herself he was real. She touched his hair, his shoulders, his hands, needing the physical proof that he was truly there. Thomas was doing the same, looking at her face with wonder and grief, seeing how much she had aged, how much she had suffered. They sat there in the dirt for a long time, just holding each other, making up for 15 years of stolen embraces. But Sarah's body had been pushed beyond its limits. Years of brutal labor, poor nutrition, and the stress of constant survival had worn her down to almost nothing. The shock and overwhelming emotion of finding her son after so long was too much for her failing heart. She felt a sharp pain in her chest and gasped, clutching at Thomas's shirt. He saw the change in her face and panic seized him. He called for help, but there were no doctors at the gathering, no medicine, nothing that could save her. Sarah knew she was dying. She could feel her heartbeat becoming irregular, could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had found her son. She had seen with her own eyes that he had survived, that he had grown into a strong and good man. That was enough. That was more than she had ever dared to hope for. She smiled at Thomas, a peaceful smile that said more than words ever could, and then her eyes slowly closed. Her last breath left her body as a soft sigh, and she was gone. Thomas held his mother's body and screamed his grief to the sky. People around him wept openly, their own losses and sorrows rising up in response to his pain. He had searched for her for so long, had finally found her, and now she was gone before they had even had a chance to truly talk, to share their stories, to begin healing together. The unfairness of it, the cruelty of being given this gift only to have it immediately snatched away, felt like more than he could bear. They buried Sarah the next day in a quiet spot under a magnolia tree. Thomas stood by her grave with the letter still in his hand, reading her words aloud one last time as a kind of eulogy. He told the gathered mourners how his mother had risked everything to write this letter, how she had loved him enough to give him this precious gift of words when she had nothing else to give. He promised to keep her memory alive, to honor her sacrifice by living a life of dignity and purpose. That night, alone in the small room he had rented, Thomas looked at the letter again by candlelight. He had read it so many times over the years that he knew every word by heart. But now, examining it closely in his grief, he noticed something he had never seen before. There was writing on the back of the paper so faded and small that it was barely visible. He held it up to the light and squinted, his heart beginning to race. The message was short but powerful. His mother had written that if he never found her, he should not despair, because she would always be with him in his heart. She told him to live fully, to never let bitterness consume him, to find joy and love even in a world that had tried to break them both. She told him that she believed in a future where their people would be truly free and that he should help build that future. She told him that her love for him was eternal, unbreakable, stronger than slavery or death or time itself. Thomas pressed the letter to his chest and wept again. But this time the tears were different. Mixed with the grief was something else. Something like hope. His mother had given him a roadmap for how to live. A final gift even more precious than the letter itself. He would honor her by following her instructions, by refusing to let hatred poison his heart, by working toward the better world she had believed in. Thomas kept that letter for the rest of his life. He married and had children of his own, and he told them their grandmother's story. He taught them to read and write, breaking the cycle of illiteracy that slavery had imposed. He worked as a teacher in schools for freed slaves, helping others gain the education that had been denied to them. When he was an old man, he carefully placed the letter in a wooden box and gave it to his oldest daughter, making her promise to keep it safe and pass it down through the generations. The letter was passed from parent to child for decades, each generation learning the story of Sarah and her sacrifice. Sometimes the letter was nearly forgotten, tucked away in attics or drawers, but it always resurfaced. It survived house fires and moves across the country, floods and wars and the chaos of a changing world. The paper became more fragile with each passing year, but the words remained clear, a testament to a mother's love and a family's resilience. By the early 2000s, the letter was in the possession of an elderly woman named Ruth, who lived in Chicago. Ruth was Sarah's great-great-great-granddaughter, though she barely knew the full story of her ancestor. The letter had been in her family so long that it had become just another old paper in a box of family documents, its true significance fading with each generation that passed. Ruth kept the box in her attic, meaning to go through it someday and organize all the old papers and photographs, but she never got around to it. She was busy with her life, with work and friends, and the thousand small concerns of modern living. When Ruth died in late 2023, at the age of 87, her granddaughter Maya was given the task of clearing out her apartment. Maya was 25 years old, a graduate student studying African American history at Northwestern University. She had loved her grandmother deeply and approached the sad task of sorting through Ruth's belongings with both grief and care. She packed up clothes to donate, gathered photographs to distribute among family members, and finally climbed the narrow stairs to the cramped attic space. The attic was hot and dusty, filled with boxes that Ruth had accumulated over a lifetime. Maya worked methodically, opening each box and deciding what to keep and what to throw away. She found old textbooks, Christmas decorations, broken appliances, and stacks of magazines. Then she opened a small wooden box that had been pushed into a corner. Inside, wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth, was a folded piece of paper that looked incredibly old. Maya carefully unfolded the paper, her historian's instincts telling her that this was something important. The handwriting was shaky, and the ink had faded to a light brown, but she could still make out the words. As she began to read, her hands started to tremble. This was a letter from an enslaved woman to her son, written in 1852. This was a primary source document from the antebellum South, the kind of artifact that museums would treasure. But more than that, this was from her own ancestor. This was her family's story. Maya sat down on the dusty attic floor and read the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. She thought about Sarah's desperation and love, about Thomas's lifelong search, about the generations of pain and separation that slavery had caused. She thought about her own life, about the privileges she enjoyed, about the education she had access to, about the freedom to make her own choices. All of this had been built on the sacrifices of people like Sarah. Over the next few weeks, Maya threw herself into research. She contacted historical societies and archives, traced her family tree back through census records and plantation documents. She confirmed that Sarah had indeed been sold from Riverside Plantation in 1852, that Thomas had been born there in 1844, that everything in the letter was historically accurate. She found records of the Magnolia Grove Plantation in Mississippi, where Sarah had been sent, found Thomas's name in Freedmen's Bureau records from Alabama in 1867. Maya also took a DNA test. Curious to learn more about her genetic ancestry, When the results came back, they showed exactly what she expected, that she was descended from enslaved people brought to America from West Africa. But they also showed something she hadn't expected. She had DNA matches with people descended from the Calloway family, the white family that had owned Riverside Plantation. Her family tree was more complicated than she had realized, twisted by the sexual exploitation that was an inescapable part of slavery. The discovery made Maya feel sick. It meant that somewhere in her family line one of her ancestors had been raped by a slave owner. This was the ugly reality that lay beneath the sanitized history lessons. The brutal truth of what slavery had actually meant for black women. Maya had studied these facts in her academic work, had read about the systemic sexual violence of slavery, but having it confirmed in her own DNA felt different. It made the history personal and immediate in a way that no textbook ever had. As Maya grappled with these discoveries, she also became aware of how they connected to her present life. She thought about the microaggressions she experienced daily. The way white professors sometimes seemed surprised by her intelligence. The way she was followed by security guards in stores. The way people clutched their purses tighter when she walked by on the street. She thought about her friend Marcus, who had been pulled over by police 17 times in the past 3 years despite never breaking any traffic laws. She thought about her cousin Jamal, who was serving 10 years in prison for drug possession, while white kids she had gone to college with used drugs openly without consequence. Maya realized that Sarah's letter wasn't just about the past, it was about the present, too. The separation and trauma that Sarah had experienced hadn't ended with slavery. It had evolved and continued in new forms. Mass incarceration was separating black families just as surely as the auction block had done. Economic inequality meant that black mothers still struggled to provide for their children. Police violence meant that black parents still lived in fear for their sons' lives. The mechanisms of oppression had changed, but the fundamental reality remained. Black people in America were still not truly free. This realization radicalized Maya in a way that her academic studies never had. She had always been interested in history, but now she understood that history wasn't something safely contained in the past. It was alive and active, still shaping the present moment. She thought about her grandmother Ruth, who had lived through Jim Crow segregation, who had been denied access to good schools and good jobs because of the color of her skin. She thought about her mother, who had been one of the first black students to integrate her elementary school in the 1960s, who had endured death threats and violence from white families who didn't want their children sitting next to a black child. Maya started attending organizing meetings for racial justice groups. She joined protests against police brutality, marched in demonstrations for reparations, volunteered with organizations, helping formerly incarcerated people rebuild their lives. She felt like she finally understood what Sarah had meant in that hidden message on the back of the letter, about working toward a better future, about not letting bitterness consume her, but also not accepting injustice passively. One night, Maya was invited to speak at a community event about her research into her family history. She stood in front of a crowded room at a local church and told Sarah's story, reading excerpts from the letter aloud. People in the audience wiped away tears. After her presentation, several elderly people came up to her with their own stories of family separation, of ancestors who had been enslaved, of the long shadows that slavery still cast over their lives. An old man named Mr. Washington shook Maya's hand and told her that his great-grandfather had also been sold away from his family in the 1850s and had spent decades searching for them without success. He said that hearing Sarah's story made him feel less alone, made him feel like his ancestors' suffering had been witnessed and honored. A middle-aged woman named Janet told Maya that her grandmother had been taken from her mother as a child during slavery and had never seen her family again, and that she had carried that trauma all her life, unable to trust people or form secure attachments because of the early wound that had never healed. Maya realized that Sarah's letter wasn't just her family's story, it was the story of millions of black families torn apart by slavery. The specific details were unique to Sarah and Thomas, but the fundamental experience of separation and loss and desperate searching was something that bound together all the descendants of enslaved people. They all carried this history in their bodies, in their nervous systems, in their deep unconscious fears of abandonment and loss. Over the following months, Maya worked with a museum curator to preserve Sarah's letter properly. The paper was fragile and needed special conservation treatment to prevent it from deteriorating further. The museum wanted to include the letter in an upcoming exhibition on slavery and family separation. Maya agreed, knowing that Sarah would have wanted her story to be told, would have wanted people to understand what slavery had really meant for those who endured it. The night before the exhibition opened, Maya stood alone in the museum gallery, looking at Sarah's letter displayed in a climate-controlled case under soft lighting. The letter looked so small and fragile, just a piece of yellowed paper covered in fading ink. But Maya knew it represented something much larger. A mother's unbreakable love, a family's resilience across generations, the unfinished work of achieving true freedom and justice. Maya thought about all the letters that had never been written because enslaved people hadn't been taught to read and write. She thought about all the stories that had been lost because they had only been preserved in oral tradition and had faded with time. She thought about her own responsibility to honor Sarah's memory by telling her story, by fighting against the ongoing legacies of slavery, by working toward the world that Sarah had dreamed of in those dark hours before dawn in 1852. As Maya stood there in the quiet museum, she felt a profound connection to Sarah across the centuries. They had never met, had lived in completely different worlds, but they were bound together by blood and history and love. Maya understood now what Sarah had meant in her final message to Thomas about always being with him in his heart. Sarah was with Maya too, her strength and courage and refusal to be broken living on in her Descendant. The letter was proof that love could survive anything, even centuries, even slavery, even death itself. Maya pulled out her phone and took a picture of the letter in its display case. She posted it on social media, with a long caption explaining Sarah's story and how it connected to contemporary struggles for racial justice. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. People from all over the country sent messages saying that Sarah's story had moved them to tears, had inspired them to learn more about their own family histories, had motivated them to get involved in activism and organizing. A journalist contacted Maya asking if she could write an article about the letter for a major newspaper. A documentary filmmaker wanted to interview Maya about her research. A publisher reached out about turning the story into a book. Maya said yes to all of it, understanding that this was how she could honor Sarah's sacrifice, by making sure her story was told as widely as possible, by ensuring that Sarah's voice would finally be heard after being silenced for so long. The exhibition opened to huge crowds. People stood in front of Sarah's letter for long minutes, reading and rereading her words, many of them wiping away tears. The museum had to extend the exhibition's run because of overwhelming public interest. School groups came on field trips, and teachers reported that students were deeply moved by Sarah's story in a way they hadn't been moved by textbook accounts of slavery. There was something about the intimate, personal nature of the letter, about seeing a mother's handwriting and reading her desperate words to her son, that made the history feel immediate and real. Maya gave talks at universities and community centers about her research. She discussed not just Sarah's story, but the broader context of family separation under slavery and how it connected to contemporary issues. She talked about the trauma that had been passed down through generations, about how the descendants of enslaved people still struggled with attachment issues and anxiety because of inherited trauma responses. She talked about reparations and how the wealth stolen from enslaved people had created the racial wealth gap that still existed today. Some people pushed back against Maya's framing, insisting that slavery was in the past and people needed to move on. But Maya would pull out statistics showing how black families still had a fraction of the wealth of white families, how black neighborhoods still had worse schools and higher pollution and less access to healthy food, how black people were still dying at the hands of police at disproportionate rates. She would explain how all of these present-day inequalities were direct results of slavery and the policies that had followed it. From Jim Crow segregation to redlining, to the war on drugs. One afternoon, Maya received an unexpected email from a man named Robert Calloway. He explained that he was a descendant of the family that had owned Riverside Plantation and had read about Maya's research in the newspaper. He said he had been doing his own family history research and had found plantation records in an old trunk in his attic, including the ledger that recorded Sarah's sale in 1852. He wondered if Maya would be interested in seeing these documents. Maya's first instinct was anger. This man was descended from the people who had enslaved her ancestors, who had torn Sarah away from Thomas, who had profited from their suffering. Part of her wanted to tell him to go to hell, but another part of her, the historian part, knew that these records could provide valuable information. After thinking about it for several days, she agreed to meet with him. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Robert was in his 50s, a lawyer who looked uncomfortable and nervous. He brought a cardboard box filled with old leather-bound ledgers and loose papers. He sat down across from Maya and immediately launched into an apology, saying he was ashamed of what his ancestors had done, that he had been horrified to learn the details of how they had treated enslaved people. Maya listened to his apology with mixed feelings. She appreciated that he acknowledged the evil of slavery, but she also knew that his family had built their wealth on the forced labor of people like Sarah. The comfortable life he enjoyed today was made possible by that stolen labor. His apology, while perhaps sincere, didn't change that fundamental reality. Still, Maya looked through the documents he had brought. The plantation ledgers contained detailed records of enslaved people bought and sold, including Sarah's name and the amount paid for her. Maya felt sick, seeing her ancestor reduced to a dollar figure in a businessman's accounting book. But the records also contained other useful information, confirming dates and details that helped Maya piece together more of Sarah's life. Robert also had letters written by his great-great-great-grandfather, the original Master Calloway who had owned Sarah. The letters were casual correspondence with other plantation owners, discussing crop yields and commodity prices, and treating enslaved people as just another form of livestock. One letter mentioned selling Sarah south and keeping her son, noting that the boy would make a good house servant once properly trained. The callous tone, the complete lack of empathy or recognition of Sarah and Thomas's humanity, made Maya feel like she might be sick. She thanked Robert for sharing the documents and asked if she could make copies for her research. He agreed immediately and said that if there was anything else he could do to help, she should let him know. As they were parting, Maya turned to him and said that if he really wanted to make amends for his family's past, he should support reparations and use his privilege and resources to fight against ongoing racial injustice. He nodded seriously and said he would think about that. In the months that followed, Maya completed her graduate thesis on Sarah's story and its connection to contemporary trauma and racial injustice. Her thesis committee was deeply impressed with her work, and she was offered a position at a university teaching African American history. She accepted, knowing that this was her calling to teach young people about this history and help them understand how it shaped the present. Maya also started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people research their family histories, particularly descendants of enslaved people who often struggled to trace their roots because records were incomplete or non-existent. She wanted to help other families find their own versions of Sarah's letter, to recover the stories that had been buried and silenced. The organization provided free DNA testing and genealogical research services, and it quickly became popular. On the anniversary of the day Maya had found Sarah's letter, she organized a ceremony at the museum where the letter was displayed. She invited descendants of enslaved families to come and share their own stories. The event was packed with people, young and old, all of them connected by this shared history of trauma and survival. They read poems and sang spirituals and talked about their ancestors and cried and laughed and held each other. At the end of the ceremony, Maya read Sarah's letter aloud one more time, her voice strong and clear. When she finished, she added her own words, speaking directly to Sarah across the gulf of time. She told her ancestor that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that her love for Thomas had rippled forward through generations, that her descendant was here now fighting for the freedom she had dreamed of. She promised Sarah that the work would continue, that they would not rest until true justice was achieved, until the world Sarah had hoped for became reality. The audience stood and applauded, many of them in tears. Maya folded the copy of the letter she had been reading from, and pressed it against her heart, feeling the weight of her ancestors' love and courage. She understood now that this was her inheritance, Not just the letter itself, but the responsibility to carry forward Sarah's legacy, to honor her sacrifice by building a better world. That night, alone in her apartment, Maya looked at a photograph of Sarah's letter that she kept on her desk. She thought about how a piece of paper, written by a desperate enslaved mother in 1852, had managed to survive for over 170 years, had been passed down through generations, had finally found its way to her. She thought about the chain of love that connected her to Sarah, an unbroken line stretching back through time. Maya understood that Sarah's story was both unique and universal. It was the specific story of one woman and her son torn apart by slavery and reunited too briefly before death separated them again. But it was also the story of every family that had been destroyed by slavery, every mother who had watched her children sold away, every child who had cried for a parent who would never return. It was the story of a nation built on the broken bodies and hearts of enslaved people, a nation that still had not fully reckoned with that legacy. But Sarah's story was also about more than suffering. It was about resilience and survival, and the power of love to transcend even the worst horrors humanity could inflict. Sarah had been stripped of her freedom, her family, her dignity, but she had not been stripped of her capacity to love. That love, expressed in the shaky handwriting on a forbidden piece of paper, had survived when everything else had been taken. It had been passed down through generations like a sacred flame, still burning bright after all these years. Maya made a vow to herself and to Sarah that she would dedicate her life to telling these stories, to fighting for justice, to helping heal the wounds that slavery had inflicted on Black families and communities. She would not let Sarah's sacrifice be forgotten. She would not let the comfortable narrative of American history erase the truth of what had been done. She would be a keeper of the flame, passing it forward to the next generation, just as it had been passed to her. The last letter, written in desperation and love by a mother about to lose everything, had become something more than just a historical artifact. It had become a call to action, a reminder of the work still left undone, a testament to the enduring power of love and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. And in Maya's hands, it had become a tool for education and organizing and change. Sarah's voice, silenced for so long, was finally being heard. Her story was being told. Her love for her son was being celebrated and honored. And through Maya and others like her, Sarah's dream of freedom was still being fought for, still being pursued, still very much alive. The letter had bridged past and present, slavery and freedom, death and life. It had proven that love truly was stronger than anything, even time itself.